And then let me go ahead and share my screen and we will get us started here. Okay. Cortland or Chelsea, can you just let me know if you can see that in full screen mode and not presenter mode?
I actually don't see anything being shared.
Hang on a second. How about now?
Yep, now it's up.
Great. Okay. And I'm trying to just finagle this so I can see you all. Okay. All right. So again, not going to talk at you for too long. I just want to make sure that we kind of organize ourselves and get this number 3 working group started. I'm not going to go over this. You all are familiar with the shared agreements. I always just like to kind of keep that there as a reminder. Again, this is working group number 3. So the focus here is to understand what the concerns are, what does the draft or the maps currently say, and how might that need to change, what are we missing, things like that. And so today's agenda, again, this isn't new. We're going to start with the existing maps because that was a comment of feedback that we received last week. And then we will get into the recommended maps, which is our different bundle. And if we have time, we can get into the neighborhood ones. But I think today we want to focus on the existing and proposed for sort of the entire area, if we can build intentional space for that. And so one more thing I just wanted to also explain is that for the sake of time and also to make sure we stay on track, we don't intend on going sort of one by one through the maps. Today's approach is going to be more to like listen and learn rather than explain and debate. We really want to understand your comments and feedback and be clear on what we need to do as a team to address them. And so with that, we'll get into part 1 of the existing conditions map. I'm gonna unshare and reshare because I've got to share the maps and I want to try to show the presentation and the map together. So bear with me a second. Okay, so you all should be able to see the existing conditions map file on the left and the presentation on the right. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. And so this is kind of where we're going to hand it to the team, right? We'll start with this first question around the existing conditions maps. We would like to understand, what are we missing within this set? And we can really kind of start wherever you all want to start. I hope that you had some time to go through these maps. And so I'll stop there if you all want to just kind of guide us on where we want to start the discussion. Any maps in particular that we want to start with first in the existing bundle?
I would just go ahead and follow the sequence that you have. I mean, that would make sense for what I'm looking at as well. Because
Okay.
I think the first one that comes up is access to opportunity.
I did have a question about that map, in fact, so
yeah, go ahead.
Be a great place to start for me.
Sure.
Access to opportunity in the very next one. Vulnerability to displacement. This is really just a question about the data. I'm wondering if the data supporting these was of different ages or available at different fidelities. I'm noticing that in access to opportunity, we're seeing much narrower blocks around the neighborhood. And on the following map, vulnerability displacement, it's really like entire neighborhoods that we're looking at. I ask because there are some incongruities between these maps that surprise me, and I'm just kind of thinking maybe it's just explained because there's narrower data available at the neighborhood level for one of them, or maybe the age of the data is different.
Okay, Jonathan, so I had a little bit of trouble hearing you. Cortland, were you able to hear the question?
Yeah, I could hear him.
Okay.
Yeah, both of these maps are taken directly from Blueprint Denver, which introduced equity concepts in the update to the Blueprint Denver plan a few years ago. And so that's presented citywide in Blueprint. And this is a zoom in of that analysis result just for this area. So it's a lot easier to see the finer grain of detail. But this is just making use of those maps. And so I think there is on the CPD website in the Blueprint Denver section, you can get a whole appendix on the methodology, what the data is, how it was analyzed. I think there's like about a 20-page report if you really want to dig deep into what data is included, where it came from, and how the index was produced. That would be the place to go.
Okay, I'll look there. Thanks.
Kathy, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think for me on this first map, as well as a lot of these that have listings of more specific detail below the colorations, it's hard to understand how those two connect. So you have on the example of the first one, access to opportunity, a darker violet to lighter violet, yet I don't know quite how it connects to neighborhood equity index, social determinants of health, access to fresh food, on and on, A through E, as well as access to watershed or walkshed, access to quality of life. So I don't think the maps explains that, other than that I can see there's some darker violet that's within the map. And it would indicate to me that we're all sort of on the lesser access, but I'm not sure if that's including everything that's under the access of opportunity or if it's specific things. So I don't think it provides enough at a first glance to even be able to interpret.
Yeah, so it's all of these, the access to opportunity, the vulnerability to displacement, they're all an index that's aggregating multiple data sources into one theme, right? So there's like 5, 6 things, components that go into producing each of these maps. So it won't tell you how the area performed on any one of those individually. It's all aggregated together to give you the big picture. So with access to opportunity, having 5 or 6 individual components, those all get factored into the index, and then this is the result. And it's trying to be more of a simple presentation of the overall result of how each of those things, when all mushed up together, is there less access or more, right? So I think that we could probably, maybe on the Blueprint website, I'm not sure if it shows how each one of those components mapped individually. I think it may, but if there's interest in like people digging in deeper on their own time to understand these things, we could probably provide access and links to those materials.
Yeah, I think it really doesn't present a story, unless you have a narrative that goes with each one of these things, or maybe a parallel map that pulls out more specifics. Like I'm looking at the vulnerability index, and it would seem to me like if you had a zoning map next to it, it might tie also to understanding why there's certain areas that are more vulnerable to displacement just by looking at the zoning map. Or if you're looking at an owner renter composite map with it, that might also help to explain more sense of vulnerability and displacement. That would help the reader understand what the message is. I think the maps as they stand now, without maybe more of an explicit narrative, how all these pull together, that it's really inconclusive if one factor is greater than the other. What I want to know is those tipping points that are really critical and what we need to be looking at as far as what needs to be addressed in the plan.
I agree, and it's like the question that Jonathan asked, like, I mean, it's hard to interpret. The most difficult map to interpret is access to opportunity. Like there's so many things packed into it, and there are things that sort of, the weights are just hard to understand how those things are happening. And I don't understand why the neighborhood equity index one isn't included, since it's like one factor to access to opportunity, but in the plan, it was an easier map to interpret, and it was more kind of intuitive, because on access to opportunity, it makes it look like, you know, Sun Valley is nailing it, and it is like, and in the future, like that, it is, as there's a lot of opportunity built into it. But being able to tell the story of why access to opportunity and neighborhood equity are totally different. And the question of displacement that Kathy was naming too, there's the zoning, but there's also like the types of ownership, and the renters in Sun Valley, it's almost all renters of people who live there where it's not industrial. But those renters have some protection against the vagaries of the private market and speculative development, because they are all DHA owned. And so it's just hard to interpret what's going on without kind of pairing a couple of things together and being able to tell the story. And so, I mean, if there is something that, if the access to opportunity really does tell a story, I think it may be helpful to be able to show how the individual have it as a summary map that has some like interesting ways of combining it, but still be able to see where the social determinants of health, where fresh food play. I don't know, it was just, I remember being really confused on the original plan, that there was such an emphasis on the access to opportunity when it seemed to confuse what I understood around some of the aspects of equity challenges.
Heidi, did you have your hand up, or did you want to add something?
I mean, I'm not sure if I find these, I think what other people are saying very well is I find them confusing, because I'm not sure what they're saying, and how like vulnerability to displacement, or, you know, referring to like the recommendation L3, which I think is referring to these maximum building heights and where to put density, but I'm not sure how it really dives into, because again, it's sort of like, I guess, saying, okay, density then solves the vulnerability, or where we need diversity of housing. So yeah, the way they're talking to each other, and what are they really saying, and do the recommendations get to it, I guess.
Yeah, even when you summarize it on the following page, you know, under 1.3.1, improving access to opportunity, you're more or less explaining it as this is a blueprint Denver map. And it gives you an average score, but it doesn't really tell you what the story is. You know, if we're saying that most of this is purple, darker purple, that seems to me like a serious story to tell. That we're limited in access and opportunity. And then you're saying, okay, this is how you can see maybe this improves the opportunities by looking at these different components that are listed. We might want to include more in that list besides what you have, but it doesn't seem like it ties the connections together again, so.
Okay, thank you. This is all very helpful. So it's kind of high level, general, a little unclear, telling the story, adding more depth is what I'm hearing. Does anyone else want to contribute to this discussion around these particular maps?
Well, I'll add a suggestion, which is that, you know, all of this was done by Blueprint at the citywide scale. And so maybe it would be helpful to have a small inset where you could see the citywide result, because it might help put some of this in perspective. Like this access to opportunity that you have on the screen right now, we see darker shades of purple, but not like the darkest shades of purple. And so maybe like seeing the citywide results and where that's located might help provide some of this context that you don't get from it just being zoomed in specifically to West. So maybe we should think about doing something like that. Might be helpful.
Jean, go ahead. I see your hand raised.
Yeah, you know, I guess I just was really confused about it and just kind of ignored it the first time around because it was like, I can't go here. Because when I was looking at it, it's like, and here's what I don't get is that Sun Valley, we haven't wanted to change, any of the map from what is, even though we know there's actual development going on, but all of the actual maps are showing what has been, with nothing going forward. So that said, when I look at this, it looks like, light lavender is, second from the end in terms of opportunity. I wonder why it's even a Nest neighborhood then. I mean, it just seems really incongruent with everything that has been portrayed and even, about Sun Valley and all of the data within, about Sun Valley. So I just think it's a real confusing representation of Sun Valley because I understand that, yes, there was some affordable housing there. So that's certainly more than in our other neighborhoods. And so that does, form some security. Yes, there's a little market now, but there wasn't then. When these maps were done, there's virtually no home ownership in the neighborhood. So I guess I just don't know why it's really, and there's really very few jobs available. There is some manufacturing, but there's very few jobs that are actually held by residents of the neighborhood. That's growing a little bit, but again, all the maps are showing a different point in time, which is much earlier. So that's why I'm just kind of confused.
I mean, I guess I would like to hear from staff is what colors do you see? Are we at 1 and 2 or 2 or 3, or is Sun Valley 4 and 5? I mean, I guess even the basic stuff, even understanding what the colors relate to, when you were referring to the bigger picture of Denver and Blueprint Denver, and we're not maybe the darkest purple. I don't know what neighborhood is, but are we in the second tier, the 1 to 2 range? What is your interpretation of those colors?
Yeah, I think that's where it would be helpful, to have the citywide map. So you could see, like, if you look at the access to opportunity and you don't see the darkest shade of purple. And so you wonder, like, oh, does that mean that there's not much of an issue? If you could see citywide, I think you would see, like, oh, there's a lot more purple here than there are in many of the other neighborhoods in the city. And that's why this is a Nest neighborhood, because it is like more purple than a lot of the rest of the city, right? Like that, I think that's the perspective that's missing by just having the zoom in.
Yvonne, I don't want your voice to go unheard. Why don't you go ahead and mute and share? You're still on mute, Yvonne.
Sorry, Val.
That's okay. Go ahead. No apologies needed.
So I know I've mentioned this before, but Valverde is predisposed to any kind of lung conditions, and because we have Florence Critton High School, I wonder what the birth rate is because of poverty-stricken mothers who are trying to raise their babies in a densely populated area of industrial companies. And so, as I've complained before about the industrial area, these capitalists who don't give back to the neighborhood, when I look at this access to opportunity, it just delves up a lot of memories about how we were hit. We had the most highest hospitalizations when COVID first hit because we're boxed in by all highways, and then we have all that pollution, and now it's caustic pollution from these industrial areas. And so looking at this map, and then, well, almost every map, we come up the highest on what equity. I mean, there's just no equity. And so when you build these plans that are going to last 20 years or so, how are you going to build in something to help mitigate some of this pollution? Is that being considered, or am I way off?
I mean, that's what I wanted to see in this plan, is what is being done to remedy the story that we're seeing in these neighborhoods. Why they're nest neighborhoods, why there's access to opportunity, why is there high displacement? Why is there low home ownership in certain areas? Why is there low job diversity? And begin to sort of tell the story through looking at what the maps are revealing, even from Blueprint Denver, you know.
I see Jean's hand up and Elizabeth. Jean, would you like to share? Okay, hand went
Sorry,
down. How
that was an old.
Oh, okay. Elizabeth?
I appreciate Cortland naming that if we saw the larger city, it would put stuff in perspective. I also, I just have, there's a level of mishmash for this map that I get why, I'm glad that this question of opportunity mapping, like the John Powell tradition of that, is included in Blueprint for Denver and here, but it sort of obfuscates what's actually going on, because all of these variables are thrown on top of each other in a way that doesn't tell a clear story. Like in this, I know on page 17 of the original plan, there was like a little neighborhood equity index. I think that equity index, we can, like, that already has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 variables in it. Like that should at least be on its own, if not unpacked a little bit, so we can see where, I mean, Sun Valley has more kids than, and probably Valverde has more kids than a lot of other areas of the city, but like that we'd be able to see something about that with the like access to healthcare, or the percent of pregnancies without first trimester prenatal care, or children at a healthy weight. Like we might be able to see those things and be able to get what's kind of going on. But like, I mean, having the access to opportunity that has all of these things thrown in might be helpful at the end to see, see how these things balance. But the access by walkshed and access to quality transit is probably some of what is making like Sun Valley look like it's rich in walksheds, and it's rich in quality transit based on the future places map and stuff, and from having a major train station there, and having bus lines. But it, like, having all of that packed in makes it look like a different sort of, I don't know, being able to handle some of these, just unpacking it a little bit and centering the neighborhood equity index of like how people are actually doing, like I think that one has more of the social determinants of health, even though it says social determinants of health and it lists, like, I think fresh food is probably a social determinant of health too. I don't know. Anyway, like, it's even unpacking that one would be helpful, because seems like it's more the outcomes of how people are actually doing, and then some of the built environment factors that contribute to it you can see a little bit more. I don't know, there's no right way to do it, but leading with access to opportunity and not having the map for neighborhood equity index is really confusing, because it doesn't really, like, and we can't tell scalarly, like, is this, like, you know, there's this one, I don't know how the units are used, like how these different scales of data, there's some, like this random really linear darker purple that looks like it goes along 6th, but like half a block, a strip on access to opportunity. Yeah, that one. Like, how did that happen? Like, what's the spatial scale that we're working at? Like, what's happening there? And is it a fluke based on how we're aggregating data? Or is it telling us something really important about what happens when you live next to a highway and you're dealing with the pollution and not a lot of great transit access. Like it's just totally, I have no idea. Like Jean, I got really frustrated when I looked at it and was like, this means nothing. And I moved on very quickly. So leading with it may confuse other people too, because it's counterintuitive in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. And Kathy added a chat message here. Leading with neighborhood equity index makes more sense to me versus access to opportunity on how the plan improves on these conditions. All of this is very helpful. I first want to say thank you because this clarifies a lot, gives us lots of context and feedback to take back to the drawing board. And I also want to keep us going so we can get into next the tree canopy and urban heat island maps. Is there anything else we want to add as far as feedback goes for the team around the equity maps from Blueprint?
Just to clarify, like, I think that as a general rule, if we can have some maps that show how people's health are, like having neighborhood equity where there's like health equity and we can tell how people are doing, what some of the outcomes are, and then be able to show some of what we think are contributing factors to that kind of broken out. And then those heat island maps are going to contribute to that story too. But if we can like be able to present the maps to be like, oh, like we've got children aren't at a healthy weight, or average life expectancy is low, and the like the percent of families below the poverty line, and the percent of high school graduates, those are all sort of like health outcomes sort of stuff, kind of, you know, like they're more of that. And then being able to tease out and just show a map of in the beginning for equity about access to fresh food, like access, or having those like in a collage where you can see on one side of the page like the neighborhood equity index, and then you can see a set of images that show what food access looks like next to park access, next to healthcare access, and you can see how those patterns are the same or different depending on those different elements. And I think that would be helpful in allowing the maps to tell a story and build our ecological literacy for what's going on. But anyway.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, no, that's great comments and feedback. I want to check in really quick with Cortland as our MPI manager. Cortland, do you have any clarification questions or any follow-up before we keep moving here? And I do see Kathy, you have your hand up. So go ahead, Cortland.
Yeah, I would say like a note is that we need to probably follow up with Grant, our GIS analyst, to see I don't know if it exists like each of these components mapped individually as opposed as they are here aggregated into an index. If that already exists, then it'd be relatively easy to provide this greater level of detail that people want to see. I just don't know if it's been done that way. So that's a follow-up question for him.
Thanks, Cortland. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, and I think before you leave these vulnerability maps and housing diversity, I mean, you're trying to tell a story with each one of those, and I think you need to make sure that it includes all the story that's in it. As I mentioned earlier about the current zoning creating displacement, that needs to be in there because it is part of the story. As you're talking about housing diversity, you need to also sort of capture what it is you're talking about in regards to housing opportunities or housing and job diversity. I guess you combine the two together under one sort of heading under 1.3.3. But when I looked at job diversity, it really was hard to understand what does innovation mean versus manufacturing versus retail. I mean, there's no definition. If I would say innovation, I would say along 17th Avenue up to, I don't know what that would be, Conejos maybe. It looks like housing to me. I understand that was part of the old St. Anthony's component. So I guess that would need to really be flushed out to see what does that mean to have innovation, because it doesn't seem to have any definition to it.
Yeah.
to describe what that means, because there may be other places we might see innovation, like on our major corridors of Federal, Alameda, Sheridan, you know,
Sure,
and
sure.
Colfax.
Yeah, that's a great point of clarification. Clearly, it's a little too planner jargony. So providing some clarity and definitions and understanding of the different terms could provide some clarity and make it more clear on what it is we're talking about around these different terms, right? Okay. Okay. All right. Anything else from anyone? I want to keep us going here because we've already spent a half hour on this one. Go ahead, Yvonne.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add, God, am I on mute?
You're
No,
good. Yeah, I can hear you.
So when we talk about a hazardous neighborhood, right away, that sends a powerful message to me. It's like a stake through my heart because, you know, growing up poor in Valverde, it was not fun. And now here we are. I'm 61 years old and we're still talking about how hazardous this neighborhood is. And so I beg you, you guys, whatever you can do, I know you're not miracle workers, but you know, we've got to stop this. I mean, I'm tired of seeing that we're a hazardous neighborhood and I'm 61 years old and it's still hazardous. So all this redlining, what they did to us is they've destroyed this neighborhood. I mean, like Elizabeth said, if we measured health, if we measured birth rates, if we measured, you know, how people go hungry, it's just not fair. And it's just madness to me. And I feel guilty because I want people to have what we have. Anyway, I'm just asking you guys to please really look at this stuff.
We appreciate you, Yvonne, and your voice is very valuable, and we appreciate just being honest and open, particularly because you are the subject matter expert of this neighborhood. So thank you for your words, and it is all noted, and we're absolutely going to do everything we can as we get back to the drawing board and work as a team to really focus and be intentional with how we address these comments and everything we're hearing from you all. So again, very grateful for your feedback and stay with us, Yvonne. It's okay. We're going to get through this. We're going to get to the finish line. Okay. So everything's going to be all right. I'm going to keep us going here. So we'll kind of switch gears over to our tree canopy, existing conditions again, and the urban heat island. I kind of want to speak to those two together, just given that it makes the most sense. And okay, see head nod. Kathy, go ahead. Why don't you start us off?
Well, I think certainly, and this also I would ties to detention and water quality as well too. So I would add that component as well, because we can really see very clear patterns of what the cost has been, unfortunately, Yvonne, about having just impervious surfaces in these areas adjacent to the industrial areas. It is impacting people's lives. And so I think that is part of what the story needs to reflect, is that there is a lack of tree canopy. There is a prevalence, a permanency of industrial, and how can that be switched up? How can that be changed? Because that's what we're really talking about in regards to what we're looking at as tree canopies, as well as what more improvements could be made to make it a more greener space, which might lead to discussions of creating more open space as well along the gulches or extending the gulches.
All
Because
right.
you've got some natural green spaces embedded within these neighborhoods with the gulch systems.
Yeah. Heidi, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, like these two maps, I think, are just there to me, that for the ecology and for systems thinking are really very, very telling and very important, and speak really to what Yvonne is saying, is that, you know, it's not the areas that are red, the areas where the heat island are, the area where we lack tree canopy, you know, and these areas are also, it'd be interesting to overlay our water basins and our flood zones. these areas that are being ignored as far as, impervious surfaces, and as far as lack of tree canopy, as far as where our water comes from and goes to, are looked to be the most ignored areas in our neighborhoods. And when you look at the opportunity areas map, which I think we're going to get to eventually, those also happen to be where the most intense development is being, I don't know whether recommended. And that to me was the biggest incongruency with this plan, is that that's where this blueprint Denver and the zoning does not speak to what we're seeing with the equity maps that I think, whatever those are trying to say, but clearly with these ecology maps and with, and that's when we're saying, this is where we want, we keep Blueprint Denver keeps saying that if we just build our way out of it, and there's no framework to say to a developer, if you're building in an area where you've got a heat island, you've got lack of tree canopy, you've got all our water access in there, and there's nothing that, we've got equity displacement, we've got this intensive manufacturing, and there's nothing that recommends to a developer. There's no requirement to address any of that. It's all that we're saying is that, okay, let's cross our fingers and keep hoping that the density and the developer is going to come along and address these questions, these issues, these big issues that are going to become even bigger. And we haven't seen them solve any of our problems yet. So that's to me the biggest inconsistency in the plan. So anyway, these maps, I think, tell a very, very big story, and I don't see answers.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you, Heidi, for the explanation and the feedback. That's very much helpful for us. And Jean, I see, has a comment here that is an update to the map. Can you erase all of those trees in the middle along the river in Sun Valley? Because with the DHA demolition, there is no trees. So we will note that, Jean. Thank you for that comment. As far as an update goes, I want to loop back to Cortland as our MPI manager. Cortland, do you have any points of clarification or any follow-up just from our comments and feedback we've heard?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Okay.
I guess, was there one of the notes I had was storm drainage and water quality was maybe a gap. And I guess I needed to confirm that, because I think we should be able to provide some maps to that effect as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have it in the quality of life section right after urban heat island, but I'm not quite sure why it wasn't included with the tree canopy and urban heat island, because I think that also is parallel to what the story is.
Are you speaking to the environmentally resilient proposed map, Kathy?
Yes.
Let me pull that one for us. Are you talking about this guy?
Yes.
Okay. So we can look at these side by side.
Right.
And
it's saying the same story. You're saying that there's the tree canopy is over in this tannish area.
Mm-hmm.
We have detention priority areas because we have so much asphalt in the industrial area.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that relate to creating more green space?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there would be more of an expansion of park space in Val Verde to offset that. That would be more of a government issue, not necessarily a private development issue.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's part of the game plan, with Denver Parks and Rec. I don't think everything's going to be solved by the developer, and it's a combination. We've got CDOT that borders the eastern section with Highway 25 and 6th Avenue intersecting is also impacting the heat island.
Mm-hmm. I believe Alameda is also a CDOT road. Is that not correct?
Right, as well as Sheridan, as well as Federal, as well as Colfax.
Mm-hmm. All our major corridors.
Yeah, and so how does that all sort of tie into it? But the volume of traffic is more higher on 6th Avenue than I-25. And is that an opportunity area for increasing tree canopy as well?
Yeah. And Chelsea, if you don't mind putting a note, I think for this one, we definitely need to loop back with our partners in DPR, specifically forestry. So if we can just jot that down. Heidi, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, and so I love so just to loop this back around to sort of the systems thinking and going and looking at this plan being less from, or not at all from an extraction base, but from an ecology base. Like, and these water, these flood zones, and even like looking, up into the, in a lot of these, sometimes the stadium district is included in the maps and sometimes it's not. And it's like, well, it's, the large area development, that's been approved. So, but I mean, but we still, with the clover and, all of these areas that are looking, if the city can, like a lot, we've talked about Riverfront Park and how those areas, the reason that the open space is so wide and that the flood zone along the river is designed the way, and there's so much space there, is because it was designed first. And so, like, what I would love to see in our plan is that we design for the green space and making space for the water and the, and layering all our mobility, and then that informs the development. The development doesn't inform. If you leave development to say, oh, okay, we've got 10% requirement of open space. I mean, that's not what we, where we see that in the, in the stadium district plan is there's really not anything that really speaks to the river, really. In the open space, it really speaks to how water moves through a floodplain. I imagine that's the same plan for the clover, that the water isn't informing the development gets put in, and then sort of there's a blue line drawn through and we're like, yes, we've done it. And we really, and maybe that was okay in the past. I don't think it was, but it's absolutely can't be how we move forward. So how can we have this stuff inform development and not the other way around, I guess would be my question.
Thank you for that, Heidi. Anything else with regards to the tree canopy, the urban heat island, how those pieces and the water quality or water basin overlaps? Anything else on this? Because I do want to keep us on time here. And next, we're just kind of getting into more existing conditions around the access and amenities from parks. Anything else anyone wants to add before we move forward?
I just wanted to add, again, we're the least tree canopies and we're the hot zone. So I just want that noted.
Yes, ma'am. We've got it on there. And I'm just checking in with the chat here. So Elizabeth, I'm going to read your message because Heidi mentioned that it would be great to talk a little bit about that. One of the amazing things about getting to see maps at the same scale of different themes next to each other is that we get to start to see relationships among them and patterns. The indexing ends up flattening it, reducing our capacity to see relationships among many factors, reducing our literacy of interrelated patterns in the living systems we're part of. When we can see the individual maps and intuitively make comparisons, then the index map can help us think through the combinations in a different way, but it's problematic and unhelpful standing on its own. Okay, and I've got another big comment from Kathy. So how do we want to have this discussion? You guys feel free to just go ahead. Elizabeth, do you want to follow up? Oh, you're okay. Oh, you're on mute.
I just wrote that as sort of a synthesis of what I was saying before. So I don't think we need to discuss it more. It's just very helpful to be able to start to notice it. And it's going to be really helpful to Kathy's point. Like, one of the things that we asked for and we want to do together is to make sure that the recommendations that we have, we can see how they tie to multiple different existing conditions elements to be able to have, like, show how this place of intervention or the transformative project is affecting multiple layers in an integrated way. And if we allow, just to make sure that there's a clear, oh, this mitigates these interrelated types of harms.
Mhm.
We understand that these interrelated issues happen to be related to zoning that was set at the same time as redlining,
Mm.
like, and be able to address that way. But that telling this curation of the existing conditions maps will help us be able to tell the story of how we're doing those integrated interventions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Kathy, I want to switch over to your comment. I'll go ahead and read that out loud. Mitigation is needed for the impact of highways, impervious surfaces, and reflects what we see in the urban heat island and tree canopy. Mitigation needs to go beyond development to CDOT, Denver Park and Rec, and capital improvement projects. Do you want to expand a little bit on that, Kathy?
Yeah, again, I think it's citing ways to mitigate. And so when we're having a conversation with CDOT needs to come to the table with resources, because I understand they also have an equity index that they're looking at. So they can also participate with their state funding in trying to lessen the impact. You know, all we hear about now is, oh, we want to expand I-25 along the Burham Yards. And, you know, that's our 10-year plan. But we don't see them coming to the table to try to deal with some of the past harm. They certainly have tried some of that with I-70, but that needs to be integrated here as well too, because they are a big player in that. And then we have capital improvement projects, which are done, in those 5-year cycles. So there's purposely elevated to address some of these issues. And when we see the combinations of that stack effect of this is impacting this neighborhood and this factor is impacting this neighborhood, that should make it a higher priority in the capital improvement projects as a way to mitigate that cumulative effect.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I mean, if we're really pointing to some really serious problems of urban heats and low birth weights, I mean, to me, then there needs to be a higher priority on how that should happen and happen quicker as a recommendation of this plan.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. All right, so it is 4:55. I'm going to keep us going here, and I do want to give us a break at the 5 o'clock hour, if that's okay, the way that we typically do. So I'm going to go through these. If there's any need to talk about any of them, just please let me know. Again, these are existing conditions and just kind of data and things that we worked with our partners, for example, in Parks and Rec, DDPHE, and other agencies to really pull these maps together. So I want to make sure that we get into the recommendation side of things. So this one is our park access map. This one is with regards to amenities. And then we have our food facilities existing conditions map, street lighting existing conditions, and then we get into mobility stuff. So with regards to any of these, are there any in particular that you all want to discuss or have any concerns around the access and amenities piece? Any in particular that we want to talk about, or can we keep going with the?
I just had a question, and maybe it's more for Parks and Rec, but
Okay.
I want to say like 30 years ago, there was money earmarked for a swimming pool at West Barvalwood Park. And then they ran into some irrigation problems, and that never came to full fruition. And back then, when family and neighbors checked into that, they said, oh, that money's gone. We had to use it for the irrigation. So is there a way to check into that? Or, I mean, why didn't we ever get a swimming pool?
Yeah, we can absolutely check in with Parks and Recreation. That would be a question for them, Yvonne, but not an issue. They've been looped in the last 2 years helping us with this plan. So we'll just follow up with you on that and ask the questions. All right. So Jonathan says he's good to move to mobility. Is everybody okay to move to mobility?
No, I would like to make a comment about the park access.
Okay.
And I'd like you to leave the right-hand map up there, because I think that also informs this map as well too on
Sure,
park access.
absolutely. As long as you guys can see both and it's clear. So
Well, that's maybe.
it's hard to show these big
Diminishing.
maps side by
Yeah.
side, but
But one of the points I wanted to make is that on the map you have in regards to the resiliency and detention areas, you're also showing some extensions of the gulches that aren't reflected in the park access map. And I think that needs to be carried over, in particular as it relates to Lakewood Gulch,
okay,
as well as Weir Gulch,
okay,
to show that there is a continuation of open space,
Mhm.
potentially, or gulches that could also inform the park access to expand.
okay,
I mean, we've always wanted to see in Villa Park the expansion of the Lakewood Gulch Park all the way to Sheridan as a
Mm,
green space. To some degree, I would think that's also happened with the Weir Gulch on the northern sort of branch that's reflected in the resiliency map that
okay,
isn't really highlighted in
Okay.
this park access map, to where now I think it's a lot of it's in a tunnel, or it's underground, or if it's on under a high wall and nobody can access it as an open space because of the way it's structured. Maybe that's the interest of Barnum, to make that more of an open space area instead of so closed off.
okay, okay,
So I think there is sort of those natural connections that could be expanded with park access, as what I see when Yvonne talks about, well, we were thinking of a pool at Marvar, and then you've got sort of some green spaces in this right-hand southeast corner of the area plan that, why couldn't they be connected more? As I've been trying to also push with the Barnum Parks north and south, why can't they be connected more?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Kathy. That's very helpful feedback. Anything else with regards? I want to get into the chat comments that we're receiving as well. Okay, so Elizabeth, you mentioned Frankie Park. That is not actually Frankie Park. This has been an ongoing conversation. So would it be a helpful suggestion for the team to just review the plan? For context, before I speak to the solution, is it's my understanding, and you all correct me if I'm wrong, that I think in talking to Mo, she mentioned that someone like just went into Google and like edited this park to say Frankie Park, but it's never been designated. Parks and Recreation does not have it named that way officially. And I do believe also there's been some ongoing campaigning in the community to try and name this park more appropriately. So my solution or suggestion on how to correct that issue is we just review all the maps in the whole plan and remove Frankie Park. And then in addition to that, in the Valverde neighborhood section, we can speak a little bit more and provide some context to the unnamed park, and that is a community asset and a benefit for the Valverde neighborhood. How does that sound as far as solution goes?
Great.
Awesome.
And it can, if it's going to have a description, there are two pocket parks that are unnamed, and both were in the 1991 plan. Both of them were supposed to be given names.
I read that. Yeah. So yes, we are aware of that. And thank you for pointing that out again. So we'll make sure to go through for consistency and just make that correction. And also loop back with Parks and Recreation. Quick question for this group. Has there been any movement on the petitioning, or is there an update on renaming the parks in Valverde? Yvonne, I think you were working on that.
Yes, I'm scheduled to speak on July 13th.
Okay.
And speaking to what City Council ordered, why it's important to give our parks a cultural name.
Okay.
And so I am scheduled to speak on that July 13th.
Okay.
So far we've hit every milestone. It's been an egregious long haul, but
Yeah.
as far as I understand, the Parks Advisory Board, because we are trying to build a new village in Valverde, and so the name Ulibarri Park is the name we're trying to name this park. And so, yes, this park goes back with my family, so it means a lot to me. Nobody loves this park more than I do.
I know that.
It's a cute little park, and it was like a block and a half from where I grew up.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how it got that name Frankie, because nobody resonates with that. So it's just, I think somebody just, I mean, it does have a lot of derogatory names. Like people say, oh, it's the alley park because it's next to an alley. Or they say,
Interesting.
oh, that's the park where we, cop some weed or whatever. So we're trying to change the narrative about that park. So yes, July 13th, we're hoping it's gonna pass and then move into the legislative process, which means I will have to present before city council. So it's a
Excellent.
long, egregious process. So thank you,
Yes.
Val, for giving me that opportunity to talk about that.
Yes, well, any way that we can support you, or if you'd like some of the team present, that's a big deal. And I want to just congratulate you. That's wonderful news. So I'm sorry that, again, government can move like molasses, but over time we will get things done, right? Okay, and then Heidi, your comment, I would love to see these 2 maps and the food maps layered with the mobility maps. Okay, that's absolutely noted. Did you want to say anything else or add context to that?
Well, I think I'd like to, I'd like to see a lot of these maps that we've just been talking about being laid over, especially with the water too, and that could, like, I would like with the equity maps, if they were fleshed out a little bit more, that these would be great way to start talking about systems, and these would be great things to be put into, like, then we can start talking about implementation, the recommendations. I just think these would be great base maps for that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that added context. All right, everyone, I don't see any more hands, so I'm going to get into mobility unless there is anything else we want to speak on with regards to adding comments and feedback for our team.
Hi, it's Jean.
Go ahead, Jean.
Hi, I just want to ask, are we going to look at the map that says parks, trails, open space recommendations? Is that coming up?
Yes, I am trying to get us over
Okay,
to the
okay.
recommendations
I just want to make
section.
sure. Yeah, okay, good.
So
I'll wait
yes.
till then. All right.
Yeah. Okay, so so we still have, I just want to kind of stop here because it's 5:04 p.m. I want to be respectful of our time. We've got mobility section in the existing conditions. That includes the future street types, all crashes, Vision Zero highway injury network, existing pedestrian challenges, transit frequency and ridership. And then that gets us into the land use map. So do we want to have the mobility conversation and then take a break? How do you all feel about moving along the mobility conversation? Are there any outstanding comments anyone wants to speak to with regards to this round of maps?
I think this is a good time to take a break so that we can sort of do that as one chunk, because I think there is something to say on these mobility maps. Yeah.
Okay, so it's 5:05 right now. Is everyone okay with reconvening at 5:10? All right. Okay, then we'll go ahead and pause here and we'll see you back in 5 minutes.
I love this.
Alrighty, everyone, welcome back. It's 5:10. I want to get us started. Okay, let's unpack mobility. Kathy, where would you like to start? And are there any maps in particular that you want me to show?
I think what's confusing to me is more on the all crashes and Vision Zero high injury network. It didn't seem like that was connecting to these other maps. They were seemed to be more of a standalone. So that's
Okay.
one of the things that sort of struck me. And then again, it's sort of under the street lights as well as pedestrian challenges. It seems like, yeah, so we have sort of a discussion about sidewalk as well as maybe safety as far as night travel for street lights. And if there are those two that can be put together, if there's gaps,
Mhm.
I think that would help to sort of see what's going on.
Okay. Yeah, that's great feedback. Thank you very much for that. And I agree. I think that's great correlation and just kind of thinking about the lighting versus the pedestrian challenges. Anything else? Anyone else want to add? Jonathan, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, hey, I guess question about how we'd like to, what kind of commentary we'd like to discuss right now. I ask because I did take some notes on these existing conditions for street types, neighborhood context maps, transit frequency, et cetera. But with very limited exception, in almost all cases, my commentary is saying, hey, I see what the existing condition is like today, and I would like to see where else in the plan we specify a desire to change some of these things.
Okay.
That said, that's not really a comment on these maps. These maps kind of are what they are. When
Right.
it says something's an arterial or it says this is currently
Sure.
the frequency and ridership, that sort of is what it is. So I'm wondering if I should hold my commentary until we get to recommendations, or if there is something we'd like to discuss here.
Yeah, and I would love to turn that question over to the group. How do you all feel? Do we want to try to kind of keep getting through existing conditions and get into recommendations? Or do we need to speak more on anything in particular with the mobility section other than Kathy's feedback? Because to your point, Jonathan, I think that your comments would be very beneficial in the recommendations section.
Yep, that's what I figured as well.
Okay.
The one thing I did want to say about the existing map is that under transit frequency and ridership, it notes that the 16L is still present, but it's like a temporary COVID closure.
Okay.
I think we should pull that reference. RTD has confirmed that that route has been permanently removed. That is
Oh,
not
wow.
just a temporary COVID closure.
Okay. Thank you for that update. We appreciate
thing.
that. And I'm sure Chelsea captured that in our notes. So thank you again, and we'll make sure that that change is made. Okay, I'm going to keep us going here because I really don't want to run out of time to get into the recommendations. Is there anything in particular we want to speak to with regards to any of the land use maps? Again, these are existing, right? And just kind of what it is, neighborhood context, future places, growth area strategy, and then we get into the building heights. So where would you all like to go with this piece?
I personally don't want to get lost in the weeds there, but
Okay.
I also I think that there's been a tension throughout the planning process about how much of what is dictated in Blueprint Denver about those parameters
Okay.
are what we have to be stuck with. And so it's an interesting thing to have those things in existing conditions because they're citywide recommendations or current plans for what should happen. And that's part of what made the access to opportunity map very confusing because it's based on that future places map. If it's close to one of those high opportunity areas, then that gives it this big boost, which is I think probably why Sun Valley, as being a regional center, shows up as huge opportunity. And so I think I don't want to get in the weeds about these, but I think for our conversation about recommendations, understanding how we want to dance the tension between some of what Blueprint Denver wants to give by right, for it's still largely developer oriented and allowing a lot more density without necessarily having the plans for how that density is going to translate into diversity of mutually beneficial uses. So that's a challenge.
Yeah. And I just do want to respond, Elizabeth, because you brought up a very specific point that I think Chelsea and I were scratching our heads yesterday as we were trying to pull these different sets of maps together. And we actually made the decision to put the Blueprint Denver maps into the existing conditions instead of the recommended maps because it's adopted in 2019. And so we thought maybe that's best to put that in there because it's existing and it's before the plan. So that was where our heads were, but I like your explanation and kind of the clarification on how we can further shape those recommendations that are put together. So Jean, I want to go to you.
I'm glad that you didn't include those as this plan's recommendations. I think that was good because that's.
And I just wanted to add context because as we're trying to brainstorm and work, this is helpful feedback. So Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm glad that is a kind of, this is the state of what is, not, in terms of a plan. I'd be more than happy to go in the weeds on a little bit of this, but I don't want to do it right now. In fact, I would really rather, since we're more into some of the environmental kinds of recommendations, I'd like to kind of table this because this is really, more density.
Sure. Yeah.
But there are some things, and one thing I'll point out is even going back to Blueprint Denver, maybe it's somewhere in the plan. I don't have a hard copy, but just figuring out what is a regional center. What does that even mean?
Okay. Yeah.
And I don't know that people that are reading this, and it's not easily found in Blueprint Denver. I just tried looking it up.
It's embedded in there. And I think one thing we talked about that could be very helpful is either an exhibit or a supplemental glossary, or we could also just begin to incorporate definitions and terms more clearly in the sidebars or wherever they show up. So definitely if you all have any options or things that might work best, definitely share that with us.
Yeah, I really think, you know, I mean, I know that there's a lot of planning jargon throughout this, but I think really when it comes to these things, because it starts to speak to the character of the neighborhood too, you know, what a regional center is.
Yeah, yeah,
Since
absolutely.
Blueprint Denver was updated in 2019, I can only think that somehow the stadium district master plan was put in, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, why would that be shown as a regional center when it was just passed in 2019, but maybe
Yeah.
they coincided? I kind of remotely remember that. But I just think that there needs to be some more descriptive
Okay.
language about what these kinds of things mean. And then I do have some questions, I think specifically, probably more to Sun Valley, and I can hold those off.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Jonathan, go ahead. I want to go to you next.
Sorry, I never put my hand down.
Okay. Kathy?
Yeah, I actually agree with Jean that I would like to table that section because I think it can take a whole meeting all on its own.
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
think we really need to spend some time on this and really look at, I guess, future places as more of a Blueprint Denver sort of version, as where growth strategy might be more of what this plan version is and how it might differ from Blueprint Denver. And then how that relates to the height recommendations. So I think those things can be looked at together at its own separate meeting, because that is really going to be the most impactful potentially. I mean, certainly what we certainly see with rezonings going on. And we'll probably need to get more into the weeds. I'd kind of like to see us go back to maybe some of the mobility as well as the pedestrian challenges and crashes. In the
Okay.
meantime.
Yeah, absolutely heard. And we have another suggestion in the chat from Heidi. I would also like to get into the weeds with this too. So maybe that can be its own meeting. So heard, we will do that. And so with that, I would love to spend, if everyone is okay, the last 40 minutes on the recommendations maps. Is everybody okay with that? All right. And do we need to have the existing conditions maps side by side, or can I expand full screen on the recommendations? What do you all think?
I'm not even
I'd
sure what
suggest
you're
going-
talking about as far as recommendation maps.
The ones on the right, Kathy, I'm just asking if I can do this so that we can take up the
Oh.
full screen, or if you all still want it side by side.
I'd say go full screen. If we refer to a prior one on the existing conditions, we can pop back over to it.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right, so then I'll just kind of quickly run through these so that we know what's in here, and then we can get started with the first one. So we've got environmental quality and climate resiliency recommendations first. Then we get into parks, trails, open space recommendations, mobility opportunities, modal priorities, bike network existing planned and opportunities, West area community input corridors, pedestrian crossings, neighborhood traffic calming, opportunity areas. And that is everything for the recommendations map. So whoever wants to get started, please feel free to just chime in. Where would we like to start?
I feel like I've made my opinion well known about that opportunities map. But I think the main thing is that, like, trying to figure out how any of those previous maps have anything to do, like how are they informing, I guess, is like, which is kind of the theme throughout this whole meeting. It's just like, how is this informing? But yeah, and going through those other maps just to see what they're really saying so that we can know how it does inform.
I put it back side by side, just in case that's helpful. And if there are any existing conditions maps that you all want to look at side by side with regards to how those are speaking to one another, I'll pull up like these ones that we went back to at the beginning.
I guess I would see the opportunity area map as also part of the built environment discussion that we're trying to table for this session.
Agreed.
Yeah, that would be helpful, probably.
Okay, so
I
then.
mean, sorry, so I'm clear on that request. Are we saying that we don't want to talk about any recommendations related to built environment because we want an entire built environment session? So we should only focus on the maps that are more mobility or parks or trail oriented in today's meeting.
Yeah, I think for the time we have. Mhm.
Okay.
I think, I mean, I think the opportunity map is complicated. I don't know. Yes, I think there's still built environment factors that are in the other maps, but
Yeah.
holding off on that
Still a lot of other things to
problematic
talk about.
opportunity areas.
Yep.
All right.
So I guess then to comment on things that are not, I think, opportunity map then, looking at parks, trails, and open space, we have a large green circle recommending that a large priority area for new parks is segments of the Barnum West neighborhood, mostly like the central and western part of the Barnum West neighborhood. The other maps in this guide, both existing conditions and future place orientation, they say that that same area that we're putting down for park priority will not have any local centers, will not have any local corridor access, will not have any changes in residential density or receive any growth. And I think that those things are like incongruent with one another. Not to say that we should not prioritize putting a park here, but if we are park or parks here, but if we are looking to enhance like park and school side access here, we should also be improving access to living by that park and by the school and shopping by the park and like dining by the park. And
sure.
Groceries by the park. So I'm not really sure. I don't think that's actually a recommendation to change this map because I do think that given the gap in, that's another transit walk-shed map also said that this area, this central between Village Park and Barnum West, also has no transit walk-shed. So it's not really an edit to this map so much as I think like 3 or 4 of our other recommendations maps, we should have mobility opportunities that are addressing this section. We should be suggesting that in contrast to Blueprint's future places map, there should be more residential density here. There should be a local center. There should be a local corridor for the ability to shop and purchase and buy things. Otherwise, we're hurting our capability to do walking, biking, etc. lifestyles. We're putting a park in a place where very few people live or need access, essentially.
Yeah, no, thank you for that feedback, Jonathan. I wonder, does anyone have thoughts or additional comments on that? Jean, I see your hand up. I apologize. Why don't we go to you?
I don't know exactly in terms of what Jonathan said, but I'm sure he's probably right. But I'm just thinking of what I'm just looking at Sun Valley, and I guess I'm a little wondering because Parks and Rec, I would imagine, looked at these, and I'm just wondering why there is no riverfront park identified as a priority area.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point. That should be on there.
It looks like that arrow is probably better access maybe to the Little Weir Gulch Park that currently exists. But there really should be kind of a rectangular type of oval, or
like a bigger boundary.
Well, a lengthwise oval all along the river there.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That's a good point.
And I don't know why, I don't know why it's not there when Parks and Rec has said they've committed funds to it.
Especially since you have like a Weir Gulch enhancement rendering, and you also have a South Platte Park rendering, but it's not on this map, right? So the Weir Gulch seems to include sort of those gaps, but nothing's listed on the South Platte.
Yeah.
Except these arrows, park access.
Sure. And also, I just for added context here, this is part of why these discussions are so important and significant for us, because as we're updating the plan, because we've been writing this plan the last year, right? A lot of the stuff is starting to become outdated, or we have new funding and new projects that are getting approved and included in our area. So it is worth looping back with our partner agencies, as well as continuing to review this plan with that lens for you all in particular of, are there any missing pieces? Is there any new items that have come up over the last year that need to be incorporated, particularly like Riverfront Park, which it's kind of funny that we did not include that, Jean. So thank you for pointing that out. Heidi, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing that these areas that are in the green circles are there because those are the areas I'm pretty sure match the gaps where you don't have access to parks. But I think, yeah, so those three areas. But to the points around parks along the river and pointing out is maybe a watershed overlay here into our flood areas and looking at the clover and how that ties all of our is going to be is a really important transit center, but it's also like completely green right now. There's nothing there. So maybe not so much. I mean, maybe this is sort of like, okay, this is what Parks and Rec is contributing. But I think as far as like what maybe we're thinking about as far as systems is that some of the areas that haven't been developed or need to, we need to think about more green space because of watersheds or water quality basins, or these areas along our gulches that don't have green along them, that those areas should be green as well, but not just part of the parks plan, but also part of our neighborhood plan and what we would want to recommend. I don't see why we wouldn't have a green area at the Clover or even all along the river. And so that informs what happens there as parks as being a priority, whether the Parks and Rec has identified it or not.
Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Heidi. Kat, I think it was Kathy. Jean, I don't know if you have a new hand or if that was an old hand, but Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think along those lines too, from what was also in the plan, and you talk about the 6th Avenue sort of bridge park, and that should be a part of this map as well to show that that is an area you want to look at. And then I think when we go back to that water detention map and see Barnum, missing sort of that piece on the western side where maybe there is a potential for a park, it could maybe tie to the Swear Gulch finger that splits off from Ware Gulch itself.
Okay.
So there's a potential like where a park could be as well too, because you actually have a gulch going through there. How can you enhance that more?
Sure.
It's sort of in a similar area.
Okay. Catching up with the comments here. Elizabeth, you asked also, is the new park bubble in Valverde by Ulibarri Park? It would benefit from investment, but may not need to be a new park.
There's just a big, where these areas for the big green bubble thing. There's one that like intersects with what's called Frankie Park on the map.
Okay.
And I just don't really know why, when there's a park why it would have said new park next to Frankie Park. Frankie Park could have more, Ulibarri Park could have more investment, but I'm not sure why there's a blob that's so close to an active park. And
that's interesting. Yeah, no, that's a great observation.
And I think if there's a map that really shows future investments where you like the park access map that's on the left right now, you can get a sense that there's like almost a network, but it has lots of breaks in it.
Yeah.
And if the park, like if we really are able to use the riverfront park with show the turquoise necklace like concept that includes the riverfront park but connects throughout the neighborhoods and shows more clearly how that fits into a system of parks, I think, and parks and bikeways, greenways, kind of like the Via Verde model in Westwood. I think that would be helpful. Like I need to look back to see where there's a linear lined thing for the the environmental quality and climate resiliency recommendations. Like looking at those like green amenity streets and green streets, like that's part of the network too, but you don't get a sense of, from looking at that, how it fits into the park system.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know, like there's still lots of, that one doesn't show how the disconnected aspects of the Weir Gulch become connected.
Okay.
It's cool that the base layer of existing maps is in the environmental quality and climate resiliency recommendations. But it's hard to see.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let me see. Jean, just acknowledging your comment, please add a priority area for park along the river in Sun Valley, in addition to descriptive Sun Valley Riverfront Park box that is in the Sun Valley recommendations. Duly noted, Jean, thank you. And then Heidi asked, wasn't Parks and Rec having discussions about greenways combined with mobility, like along 14th? I'm not too sure about that one.
It looks like the 14th is a green amenity street in this recommendation space.
Yeah, and it in
But
that
a green street, not a green amenity street.
The hatched dots. Yeah.
Yeah.
and it's a green, you know, it's talking about that, but then in the mobility recommendations, it talks about 14th being a neighborhood bikeway, which could basically be a little bit of nothing or something. But I don't know. I just feel like the mobility and the parks and the greenways, that would be more combined. It feels like, you know, Denver, we think about bike, you know, as a recreational thing, it's more emphasis on it being recreational as opposed to being a commuter. And having the greenways and having those along, having trees along the main, you know, bike routes, and making sure that those are good shaded, accessible places to ride bikes. And also maybe we can add a food layer on that too, because mobility and access and food, it's all sort of speaks to some basic equity and resilience too.
And the intersectionality of it. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure if Jonathan or Kathy had their hand up first, so apologize.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
All right, yeah, so I think a first commentary on a couple of the mobility and modal priority areas here is just disagreement between the maps, as this is probably just a little bit of, I guess, cleanup, something along those lines. But by way of example, 10th Avenue is identified as a green amenity street. And then also on the modal priority map, it is indicated as a bike and transit priority street. But then on mobility opportunities, it has no indicators at all. Like it doesn't have the little flag for mobility priority. It doesn't have it for bike priority, which was its other identifier. Same thing is happening with 14th and 17th and parts of West Colfax, where on one of the maps, there are either green amenity streets or green water quality streets. And in a couple of these maps, bike modal priority or bike and pedestrian, but they don't have any bike priority icons on the mobility opportunities map, and they don't have the little tree indicator suggesting a green street on that mobility opportunities map either. Yeah, so I think it's really just like mobility opportunities and the green streets and the modal priority maps don't always agree with each other. It seems the mobility opportunities is under denoting things generally.
I think it would be helpful if we could, Jonathan, if you could type those observations up in the chat, then we'd have it documented. It'll be easier for us to look into it.
Sure thing.
Thank you, Jonathan. Those are very helpful comments. Thank you. Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, and along those lines too, when you go back and look at parks, trails, and open space map, you have these big green stripes along Colfax Avenue, Federal Boulevard, Alameda. And I'm not, I mean, it seems like certainly already Federal Boulevard is a designated parkway, but it doesn't have the designated parkway fill unless you're north of 17th, I guess, or even 23rd. I think that needs to be expanded to really show how that is. As for Alameda, you have sort of a parkway fill along Knox Court to Sheridan with a median, but it doesn't have, more of that flush out. I'm not quite sure what's being articulated for Colfax. Because is that to indicate these green stripes that they're sort of looking at them as parkways?
I'm not too sure on a response to that, Kathy. Cortland, do you want to add anything?
I'll have to admit that I missed the comment because I was looking at the mobility one that Jonathan was just pointing out. And so I'm sorry, I'd have to ask you to say it again.
It's just looking at the parks, trails, and open space map where you have big, wide green stripes along Colfax, Federal, and Alameda.
Mhm.
And I know that Federal is a designated parkway. Probably that needs to be enhanced more. Alameda sort of looks like a partial parkway with Knox to Sheridan, but it doesn't have the designation. And I'm not sure what's meant by the Colfax one.
Hmm.
I mean, there's a median in places, but it's not necessarily a green sort of parkway. Is that intended to be a designated
Kathy,
parkway?
Kathy, you're speaking to this big green, in the legend, it's identified as development incentive priority areas
Right,
for
I'm
new public
assuming
space.
It's that color. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that means.
Yeah, I don't think that it means that it's a parkway. It's saying that it's an area to apply an incentive to try to get more public space. That's how I would read it.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean, public space? Does that mean like you have outdoor furniture, you have plazas, you have, amenities like that? But when you look at Alameda, from particularly Knox Court to Sheridan, you do have a median with landscaping. And is also the case somewhat with Federal Boulevard. You have a median with landscaping. And that is a designated parkway. So, I mean, how can that be pulled out even further? And I will certainly put that in the chat.
Okay. And just for further clarity, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that Alameda Avenue is a state highway, does belong to CDOT. And I think it'd be worth looping back with Dottie because I could be incorrect, but I think there has been over the last couple of years quite a bit of discussion and ongoing conversation around potentially designating Alameda Avenue as a parkway. However, what would need to happen, my understanding of it, is that the city would have to then take over that CDOT highway, and that has not happened. So I'm not too sure where those discussions.
And that has not happened with Federal Boulevard either.
Oh,
and
it has not.
And Federal Boulevard is a parkway, a designated parkway.
Interesting. Okay. Cortland, who would we loop back with on that? Would it be Dottie or would it be also Parks and Recreation given the parkway component?
So I think TPR for the parkway component. But I think it may be that I'm misunderstanding it as well, but I think that what's mapped here is not intended to be getting at parkway, that's a different concept from what this map is intending to recommend. But we need to dig into that because I think there'd be written recommendations in support of this development incentive idea that I don't have like at the top of my head right now, but it's something we could look at harder in between meetings.
Yeah. And Kathy, what I'm hearing is I'm trying to clarify as well. Are we saying that the parkway component is something that's missing or something that you'd want to see included in the plan? as far
Yes.
as like the mapping goes?
Yes, both and,
Okay.
for
Okay.
sure. I mean, we have Federal Boulevard as a designated parkway, yet in this section of the Federal Boulevard, it's got a real mixed bag of some median amenities.
Okay.
And then the same thing with Alameda. Part of it sort of got some median amenities and other landscaping. And Colfax does have sort of some interesting lighting that kind of goes on. I think they've been doing street lights that are sort of different characteristics. They got that weird cattail sort of light thing.
Yeah. And I think that's
just
part of the
median
Denver, I believe that is part of the Denver street lighting initiative. That's also included, I believe, in the community safety section and quality of life. Okay. Let me see. Am I missing anybody's hands? Heidi, go ahead.
I guess generally with the mobility section, I mean, I think that this reflects a lot of this, well, maybe the opportunities. I mean, there's a lot of language in the mobility section talking about bold changes. And what I kind of feel is that these are recommendations that have been worked on based on maybe what can be done or what Dottie has talked about being done, combined with other plans. But I'm not sure if generally it feels like that this plan is going to, it feels already dated, and if it's going to transcend into the next decade or two, especially when we see all kinds of different multimodal transportation around, like bikes, electric bikes, like the hover, like people are going to be needing to pass people inside these bike lanes, and people are in the streets and on sidewalks. It's like I'm not even sure, like it's hard for me to even read these maps because it feels kind of like this is just sort of like, oh, this is what we talked about, so this is what we'll do. But I'm not sure. It doesn't feel bold enough, and it doesn't feel like it's gonna it doesn't feel like it's a future recommendation, I guess.
Okay.
Like it's a commentary on what we've already talked about, which doesn't get us where we need to be.
Okay. Thank you, Heidi. And then I also am missing a number of things in the chat. Jonathan, why don't you go ahead, and then I want to take us back to the chat just so we don't miss anybody's comments. Jonathan, you wanna go
Sure.
ahead?
Yep. Sorry, I was just getting muted.
No worries.
Sort of following on Heidi's comment there. Some of my last commentary regarded, I guess, inconsistencies between the maps, but I think commentary on the maps. What I think they might be missing here is, by way of example, Barnum West and Villa Park each have only one east-west bike modal priority identified, nearly no pedestrian priorities in their entire neighborhoods, and overall seem mostly empty for non-automotive priority. So if we're looking at being transformative with mobility, it looks a lot like on that modal priority map, Barnum West and a lot of Villa Park are being left out. Somewhat similarly, just stepping back and looking at the plan for bike networks as a whole, there are almost no designated protected bike lanes in the entire West area, despite known research demonstrating that only those lane types improve both the perception and reality of mobility and safety in U.S. contexts. So when we're talking about being a bit more transformative, I'm where I look at these maps and we're saying there's a huge section that will have nothing but automotive priority, and then overall, what I'm seeing on the page is a lot of, I guess, maybe neighborhood bikeways in some cases, maybe a painted bike lane, something along those lines. I'm not seeing a lot in those maps that suggest bold action on mobility.
Okay. Thank you for that feedback, Jonathan. And we'll definitely capture that and make sure to revisit that. And grateful for calling out, these kind of gaps and sort of disconnects here. Let's see. I want to go to the chat. Elizabeth, I want to go to what are these input corridors? And that is a great question. And I really wish Eugene was here, being that he spearheaded this section. Cortland,
Jonathan figured it out, but
Oh.
it's really confusing. It's really confusingly presented even in the plan, and we have different numbers of pages, but page 119, recommendations, and M6 is saying that in some process, the community identified those areas as priorities for investment. So the community input corridors in some way are saying the community wanted to improve those areas, but it's unclear from the plan what community processes generated that input. It's unclear. Like the title is weird because it makes it sound like it might be asking for input, but it's just very confusing.
Okay, okay. Thank you for
But
that clarity.
It appears to be M6,
Okay,
which in my draft shows up, the recommendation shows up after the map. So the map, you see the map first and it makes no sense.
okay, okay. Thank you for unraveling that, because there's a lot going on in the chat. So I'm just kind of going through, and so it helps clear up with the explanation. Thank you. And let's see here, still catching up. Kathy, I see that you put in a comment. Also wondering why 8th Avenue from Knox Court to Federal Boulevard can be recommended for a parkway. West Denver in general has been neglected for these designations. Oh, that was what we just spoke to, Kathy. You were just putting that. Oh, you're on mute, Kathy.
It's also including another area that I didn't cover, so I just put it in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Any other comments? We have about 10 more minutes, so this is great. And we've basically covered everything with the exception of tabling the stuff that we mentioned earlier. So what other pieces of the recommendations maps do we want to speak to? Jonathan, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, quick question just about what to talk about with the remainder of this time. If I recall from our initial agenda setting session, and then as we discussed today, we'll have a separate meeting, one if not two, on the land use maps, but also land use recommendations. Today is mostly focused on maps and how they look and how they relate to each other. We haven't dived a lot into the recommendations that appear in these sections. Do we want to talk about recommendations related to mobility since we are looking at those maps? Or given limited time and hopefully a session on mobility? I guess that's the question. Do we have a separate session on mobility to talk about those things, or should we bring those up now because this might be the last opportunity?
That's a great question, Jonathan. So I will start to respond to that and then lean on Cortland and or Chelsea to follow up or assist with support. But so we're kind of just carving this up based off of the feedback we're receiving from the small working group. So that said, this number 3 meeting was going to be specifically dedicated to the map review, which we actually kind of successfully got through most of it. So I'm really glad for that. But yes, to the point of there will be follow-up discussions going back to the themes and the categories that we have identified in organizing all of our comments and concerns and things that we've received, particularly since March. So yes, there will be a mobility specific discussion and focus group later on down the line in our small working group series. And we will bring back the maps. I think if I'm hearing the group correctly and just remembering our discussions, it was best for us to look at the maps together from an existing and a recommendations perspective to really understand if there are, any kind of getting back to our questions here, contradictions, conflicts between the maps. And then I think we also covered a lot of this throughout this discussion, right? What quality of life map content needs integration into other maps. But I did want to get back to our focused questions just to make sure that we did cover everything. And I'm going to stop talking and very quickly just follow up with Cortland and or Chelsea if you'd like to add anything to that response.
Yeah, I guess the question seems like it's, if we need to dive into the written recommendations, is that going to be a separate session? And that's how we laid it out originally. Like by identifying the topics. Mobility was one of them, and we'd have a session dedicated to that. But I think since we're talking about the maps, I think it's very helpful if you have more comments about things being mapped in a way that doesn't make sense or seem wrong, or that you would edit, that we shouldn't just wait until we get to the recommendations, like, because they work together, right? The maps are supposed to be showing like where these recommendations apply. And so if graphically it's like, well, what about this street segment or that one? I feel like it's fair game to bring it up now, and helpful rather than waiting possibly weeks to talk about it.
Thank you, Cortland.
I think that sounds great. I'm glad we got to start. Like, I didn't get to prepare looking over them in the way that I had hoped. So I'm really glad that we got to do this first blush around it. And I think some of this, like, more fine-tuned looking back at it to make sure that the existing conditions still jive, like Jean's ability to say, yeah, there are no trees there anymore, so that we can update those with our own lived experience of those areas. And we can continue to go through that and give feedback in the interim between next meeting. I think the integration, like starting to see these patterns together and being able to look at how the different layers show up, so that we make sure that that our mobility recommendations, as Jonathan was pointing out, that those are and Heidi were integrated with our water and like green infrastructure recommendations, that there's not anything incompatible, but that they reinforce each other. Those sorts of things are going to be helpful. And if maybe we can continue to look at these. And I think one of the key things that we've talked about in the past is that, like, the Blueprint Denver emphasis is on these opportunity areas. And even though there's an aspect of that that's about equity, there's also an aspect of that that's just like directing, like a lot of investment direction. And so being able to think about resiliency corridors and vitality zones that integrate our affordable housing strategies with our other investments, so that we do get that sweeter spot where we can show how if we're increasing density, that is very clearly increasing a diversity of the different elements that allow that to be a walkable, vital, low carbon emitting combination that's really serving people and not displacing people. So anyway, that integration and thinking of how do these layers contribute to resiliency corridors and vitality zones, and then how does that mesh or disconnect from what's called opportunity zone? That's like the summary recommendation there for future growth.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
And kind of along those lines, as far as before we leave the maps, I could really see that we really didn't look at the all crashes and vision zero high injury networks, but they really have some high parallels to the parks and trail and open space, particularly that development incentive priority areas along Colfax, Federal, and Alameda. So I think we need to overlap those two maps together to show if these are high crash rate areas, how is that mitigated with maybe more park, trails, open space, amenities.
So I'm seeing there's quite a bit coming in. Yvonne, I see that you put in a chat comment. I'll get to that in just a second. And Elizabeth, I see your hand up. I just want to make a quick observation. It's 5:57 and we have not heard from our stellar team member, Shayla. So I just want to make some space for your voice, Shayla. Is there anything that you want to highlight or that you would like to discuss with the team, and anything that we can take back? Not to put you on the spot, but.
No, I've been in agreement for most everything that's been said. And
Okay.
I think that when we get further into the weeds discussing recommendations, I'll have more to contribute. So,
Excellent. Okay. Just want to make sure that you don't go unmissed, because your
Thank
voice
you.
is very impactful and significant here.
I
Go
appreciate
ahead. Elizabeth, did you want to speak?
Sure. Quickly, I was just starting to type in the chat, but when we get to the neighborhood map stuff in the next meeting, can you also present how you're renaming or organizing the recommendations so that we can easily relate the neighborhood level recommendations to the general recommendations so that they're the general and the specific are talking to each other?
Yeah, absolutely. We can try to make it happen in a way that is understandable. I might need to follow up with you just to make sure that we're doing it correctly and that it is something that's a visual we can understand. But I don't think that that's impossible. I just think like strategically we need to figure out how we would layer that and show that as far as the workshopping goes. But I think that's a great suggestion. And then Yvonne, I want to capture your comment with the last minute here. Can you please direct me to the area that speaks to the corner of Lipan off Alameda next to the South Platte River? I did walk this area recently and it seems like it has been neglected and abandoned area, not walkable as there is a small sidewalk that is not complete. Do you want to add some context and just speak on that a little bit, Yvonne?
Well, I mean, you can just email where it's at in the plan. I know I read something about that area. And so if we're out of time, if I could just maybe get, because I do think that area it's just being set up for, you know, I don't know, just gang activity or some kind of, it needs to be refurbished or more attention. It needs more attention.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Yvonne. Yes, absolutely. We'll note that. We'll follow up with you on that. And I also want to respect everyone's time. It's 6 o'clock, but again, we can still build space if there's anything else, any burning comments that we have missed. Anyone else for the good of the group before we end? All right, everybody. With that, have a wonderful evening, and we will be following up with you. Also, as a reminder, we have our steering committee meeting on Tuesday. So next week is a really big push for everyone, and we will be holding that meeting to basically provide transparency, update the larger group on the things we've been working on, next steps, and other things like that is what you can expect. And then our team's going to go back to the drawing board and reconvene on preparing for next Wednesday. So we'll make sure to send out notifications potentially Monday or Tuesday. Bear with us just because it's been a little hectic with getting these weeklies ready and we want to do it with full intention. So if there isn't anything else, I wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you again so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
night. Thank you.